Hello, my name's David Embry. I teach in the field of new religions in the Department of Religious Studies, and I'm happy to be a part of this particular series to share with you some about new religions. And you might be saying, what are new religions? What are we talking about here? Well, most of us who've lived very long in this world have kind of a familiar landscape of what religions are commonly out and about. Obviously, we're familiar with Christianity, Judaism. We've probably heard quite a bit about Islam, perhaps even Hinduism and Buddhism. There are other world religions. Those tend to be the 5 most commonly noticed, but sometimes in that basic landscape, suddenly there's a jarring insertion. You see something or hear something about Scientology, about something called Heaven's Gate. You hear about these groups that seem surprising and odd, and you wonder, how do they fit with all these other religions? Sometimes it's like driving by a wilderness area, and there in the middle of it you suddenly see a McDonald's golden arch sticking out. Where did that come from and why? Well, obviously we can't talk entirely about all that in the little time we have together, but I do want to introduce to you the idea of new religions and how they fit in the world landscape, more particularly in the American landscape. To do so, we need to go back to the beginnings of this class and speak just for a moment about, what is religion. Many people come with predefined ideas about religion as requiring a certain sort of deity or a certain sort of practice. A lot of new religions don't begin there at all. And so to understand to understand new religions, we need to think from a worldview perspective. What is worldview? Well, perhaps you recall from some earlier reading in this class, worldview is this basic set of presumptions about how the world works and how we should respond to it. Some basic worldview questions include things like, who am I? Where have I come from? Where am I going? What matters? What, if anything, is ultimately real? What is the meaning of human history? And what is appropriate behavior and why? Every human being has a worldview. Sometimes in our world people talk about religion versus science, or they talk about believers versus non-believers, and try to make the world into a divided place where there are religious and non-religious people. But if you look at the world from a worldview perspective, everyone has an idea of ultimate reality. Everybody has an idea of where we fit somehow with that ultimate reality, and thus what our obligations are, how we should respond. Now, some of those answers are theistic answers. They begin with a God, they begin with a deity, somebody or something out there, or somebodies. But on the other hand, there are many worldviews that are non-theistic. They do not start with God. They start with some other basis of reality. There are historic religions that fall into both those categories: Christianity, Judaism, Islam, very, very theistic. Basic Buddhism, kind of non-theistic. Now, I say all this to introduce the idea that when we talk about new religions, there will be people who say, well, I've met people who practice that, and that's not really a religion. That's more a philosophy or a way of life. Well, philosophy or way of life that is dependent upon a certain set of presuppositions and so on, it is a religion by the worldview definition, whether or not it includes something divine, or whether or not it involves actual worship, or whether or not it involves some of those things that we kind of equate with the traditional big world religions of the world. So back to this question of what do we mean by new religions? I often have students, when I start speaking of new religions, say, oh, yes. I went to a church a few weeks ago, and man, was it a new religion. They had a rock band, and the guy who stood up front didn't even wear a suit, and people were just kind of talking with each other out in the pews and so on. That must be some kind of new religion. Generally, after asking a few questions, I find out that student was just visiting some new, possibly charismatic or Pentecostal version of Christianity. And that itself is not a new religion. That is a new expression of a traditional religion. And certainly all traditional religions have their new expressions. What we're talking about here are religions that have just emerged in the last couple of hundred years, religions that often begin very intently following a particular leader, often that seem to be, at least initially, way outside our cultural comfort zone. Oh, some of you are thinking, yes, you're talking about cults. Well, cult is an interesting word. I get phone calls regularly in my office saying, I want to tell you about a group. I'm terribly concerned that this group is a cult. I got to tell you honestly that that's a term we're trying to get away from. And it's not just political correctness. The term cult has become burdened with all sorts of additional meaning that has nothing to do with a particular type of religion. When somebody asks me if a particular group is a cult, they aren't necessarily asking anything about when it began or how it's organized or what they believe. What they're primarily asking is this group dangerous? Certainly, the last 30 years have provided ample reason for being fearful of certain types of new religions. Back in 1978, there was the Jonestown scenario, which took place in South America. There was mostly American citizens who had traveled down there. Over 800 people died in that incident. More recently, the Heaven's Gate situation out in California about the late 90s, where only, quote unquote, only about 42 people died, but still there's this association of a new religion with death and destruction. In more recent times, there have been other groups that have made threatening noises. Consequently, certainly the David Koresh situation down in Waco in the earlier 90s. Again, we saw many people die as a result of that particular religious group's ideas. So oftentimes when people are asking me, is a particular group a cult, they're saying, should I be fearful for people's lives involved? That's one of the reasons we're trying to shy away from that word. Certainly there are new religions which are dangerous. There are also expressions of some old religions that could be, in certain settings, dangerous to those people who participate or to others who happen to be nearby and raise their wrath. But not all new religions are dangerous. And again, the term cult has come to primarily mean any group that I personally don't like. And many of the people who call me and want to identify a group as a cult, or even sometimes groups ask me to come in and do seminars about quote-unquote cults, usually they're trying to demonize a particular group and say, oh, everybody must stay away from these people. Well, there are certainly variations in technique and in tactic, very, very big differences in belief systems and in practices, but simply to use cult as a label that somehow dismisses particular groups by saying, well, we don't need to talk about them, we've already said all that needs to be said, that's a cult, is just not good scholarship. So we use the term new religious movements. We previously used the term new American religions until we began to recognize that in the world in which we live, there really is no such thing as a uniquely American religion. These days, with the internet, these days with easy travel, groups come and go. There are no geographical boundaries. A group that starts in China may well wind up much better established in the United States than it ever was in China. For instance, Falun Gong is an example of that. On the other hand, some groups that begin in the United States may have a rough go here, but might find many people who practice it in Africa or South America. And then there are the groups that are essentially virtual groups. They exist out on the internet and really don't have much of a physical presence as far as group size goes anywhere. They're pretty much in cyberspace. So what are we talking about then? If we can't call them cults, if they aren't traditional religions, if they aren't just old religions with new guitars, who are we talking about here? Well, the commonalities among new religions include this. We speak of them as originating since about 1800. 1800, that's not very new. What are we talking about? Well, compared to Christianity, compared to even Islam, the newest of what we consider the major world religions, that is quite new indeed. these also are groups which are distinctive enough from other existing world religions to be regarded as unique. They have to have different doctrines or different books or different leaders or different goals, enough so that they cannot be seen as just a natural extension. However, even some of the groups that have obviously derived from Christianity or from Islam can declare themselves essentially to be a new religion by establishing a historic or a discontinuity with the history of the group. For instance, historically, the Mormons have said that Christianity was lost for nearly 2,000 years, 1,800 years to be more specific, and only when Joseph Smith restored the church was there any Christianity in the world from the time of Jesus until that particular point. We thus regard them as a new religion, even though many of their tenets and much of their language is identical to historic Christianity. They themselves have said, we are not like those guys. We are a different religion. Often, generally these groups, have a unique and charismatic founder who gets the group going and then lives on generally as the ideal that everyone wants to emulate. Another function, or another feature rather, of new religious movements is that at least initially they tend to create a certain level of tension with the greater society. Yeah, you may be familiar with the concept of church, sect, cult. This is a concept where church is the word used for groups that are acceptable to general society. They may believe things differently from their neighbors, but nobody sees them as particularly threatening. Live and let live. A sect group, on the other hand, tends to slightly increase the level of tension. People kind of wonder why they do things the way they do. Sect groups tend to see themselves different from the rest of society, perhaps talk differently, dress differently, whatever. But the word cult historically then was used as these are the guys totally at odds with society. Church, sect, cult. Well, again, we don't like using the term cult, but that is one of the parameters or one of the characteristics of new religions. Because of their historic discontinuity, because of their differing beliefs, because often of choices they make that put them outside the mainstream of society, there is a certain level of tension. Now, in some cases over time, the tension diminishes and they look more and more like a church. But other groups primarily identify themselves in oppositional terms. In other words, they identify themselves in terms of who they're against and why they aren't like anybody else, and so the tension remains for long periods of time. Now, to say those things about these groups, they have come since 1800 and so on, puts them into a general group. And you might say, again, well, that's just not very new. That encapsulates a whole variety of things, and those aren't necessarily what I think of as new religions. Well, those of us who study new religions tend to talk about new religions and new religions. There has certainly been a wealth of new religions that have originated since the 1960s, especially that have been observable in the United States. And so when we talk about new religions, we're talking about everything back to 1800. When we talk about new religions, we tend to talk about things from the 1960s until the present. And as we go into our next lecture beyond this one, we'll actually give you an example of one from each of those two categories. So, who, what, when, where, and why? What are we talking about here? Well, I tend to classify new religions in a variety of categories. On the one hand, you've got the entrepreneurial upstarts. These are the groups that would kind of fit your basic idea about what a quote-unquote cult or a new religion would look like. These are first generational. They're generally people who are following the same leader. Here in the Ozarks right now, there's a group called the 12 Tribes. I say in the Ozarks. They are distributed about the world. They also call themselves the Commonwealth of Israel. Prime example of a first generational entrepreneurial upstart. Their leader, Albert Eugene Spriggs, is still living, and they consult him regularly for questions. They are still developing their structures. They are still kind of nailing down what the big picture is for them. entrepreneurial upstarts, kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum, would be what I call, this is Dave Embry's label for them, the big box franchises. These are the groups that have been around for quite some time and are familiar on the American landscape. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the Mormons, the Jehovah's Witnesses, Christian Science, Seventh-day Adventists. All these are groups that, by virtue of their beliefs or by their own statements, have separated themselves from, shall we say, historical mainstream Christianity and have proclaimed themselves to be something different. Now, most of you probably do not feel the same way about the Mormons who live down the street as you might about some people who live on a farm out in the middle of the Ozarks and, you know, who grow all organic vegetables and so on. But they fit into the same category of new religions. A couple of other types of categories for new religious movements. We've got the second generation Magi followers. Now, Magus is a term that we use for the leader, the unique charismatic founder of a new religion. Well, what happens when that individual dies? Well, there are many people for whom that individual is still the ideal. They still tend to honor him or her. They still want to be just like them. So there's kind of a diminishing but still intense effect that this person's legacy must be maintained. It's not quite the same as having them there with you, but it's also not the same as being removed several generations. There's a passion that we must carry on this person's ideals. We also, in the United States particularly, experience uniquely Americanized world religions. And what we wind up with when we're talking about something like the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, which did not necessarily originate here, nor is it confined to the United States, but in its heyday it flourished more here than any place else, or Soka Gakkai Buddhism, or Nation of Islam, which is an American, a uniquely American group. These are branches of other world religions that have uniquely American forms, and whereas the traditional world religion, the root, has not necessarily done that well in the United States, these particularly Americanized offshoots have done very well in the U.S. market. I mean, it's very common now to be on the plaza in Kansas City, Missouri, and see the guys in the orange robes with shaved heads chanting and singing and playing finger cymbals, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Rama, Rama Rama. You know, Hinduism, as it's practiced in India, has never taken off very well in the United States. But the Hare Krishna movement, especially in the 1970s and 80s, did very well here. Another group that I would like to mention, again, I alluded to them earlier, are virtual new religious communities, communities that exist on the internet. And if you do a little bit of surfing about alternative religions, you can find all sorts of bizarre things, Church of the Blind Chihuahua, and all sorts of things, many of which appear to be jokes, but some of which are taken very, very seriously by their practitioners. There is a consistent worldview there. There are rational, sorry about all the stammering, rational practices based upon those belief systems that people get into and practice as a result of this. And none of the members may ever face-to-face meet one another. They may be scattered throughout the world. But due to their shared belief system, their shared community on the web, they pull together many of the same attributes and some of the same positives that people derive from other religions. So who gets into these and why? What's going on with new religions? Why are we hearing so much about them now? Well, one of the reasons we're hearing about them so much now is just because of the preponderance of media. Very little takes place in our world today that is not broadcast in some form or another. Blogging and other forms of webcasting has raised this to a whole new level, where just about anything anybody thinks, just about anything anybody does, just about anything anybody believes is out there and accessible for other people. Perhaps there have been many new religious upstarts that have come and gone that we've simply never heard of, because unless you happen to be in a particular place at a particular time and somehow or another get a particular pamphlet, they came and went and we didn't know. Well, today we know about so many more because they're broadcasting themselves electronically, they're broadcasting themselves in several ways. But does it indeed seem like in the last few decades there have been more than in the decades before? Yes, it does. It certainly does. There are some arguments among scholars about whether, again, many of them simply came and went and we didn't know, and now we have better ways of recording them. But certain individuals have done a lot of study to say that the world, and especially the United States, since that's kind of our local lab where we can see what's going on, things have changed dramatically here, which have opened the door for new religions. Some of those changes would include a dramatic change in values. Up through about World War II in the United States, Judeo-Christian values were very strong, even among those people who did not necessarily practice those religions passionately or even on a regular basis. Indeed, the apex for involvement in Judaism and Christianity in the United States did not come until the late 1950s, which by that time the Judeo-Christian values were already beginning to decline, and in that vacuum, people began to look for other answers to their questions about values and about truth. A second thing that happened at approximately the same time, perhaps a few years later, was the breakdown of the American family structure. Prior to the 1970s in the United States, even if they were damaged, even if they were challenged, families tended to stay together for the benefit of the children, or because it was too expensive to get a divorce, or for any number of reasons. But beginning with the no-fault divorce laws in the 1970s, this allowed for families to dissolve, traditional families to dissolve much more easily, opening up many circumstances for people to be seeking surrogate families, people to be seeking alternative models for structuring their lives in the context of other people, and consequently many groups that arose that looked more like families, and in some cases even called themselves families, were able to attract a lot of people looking for that sort of relationship and that sort of structure. But something else that took place, again, during the 1960s, 70s, even up till the present, is a decline in people's confidence and, shall we say, respect for traditional religious institutions. Whether you're talking about some of the big issues that took place in the 60s and 70s, the whole God is dead controversy. In the 1970s, the rise of the religious right and people's beliefs in general that conservative Christianity was getting too engaged in political issues and not enough with the spiritual. Whether it was the scandals that have gone on in the Roman Catholic Church with pedophilia and the church's sometimes very inappropriate responses, there has been a general degradation in people's respect for traditional religious institutions. Once again, that creates a vacuum. If you don't trust the institutions that we have had, where do you turn? Well, there have been plenty of people willing to step up and say, we've got something different, we've got something better. Please come and check this out. And so, since the 1960s, the new religions have boomed in the United States and around the world. They have had easier means of broadcasting themselves through the television age and then eventually the computer age. Again, there are no national boundaries. Worldwide broadcasting of ideas is very easy and accessible to just about anybody. Some of our traditional structures have been reduced in their influence, which has produced just a wonderful time for people to begin and to propagate new religions. So, why is it that it seems like we hear so much about them? Well, we have all this media, but we also have all these celebrities. And in recent years, it seems that many people in the public eye have adopted alternative religions and been very dramatic and very overt about that. whether it's John Travolta and Tom Cruise talking about Scientology every chance they get, whether it was presidential candidate, presidential hopeful, I guess you would call him, Mitt Romney, being asked questions continuously about his historic association with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and what they really believed. Whether it's Madonna and Demi Moore and other actresses wearing little red Kabbalah bracelets. It just seems that every time you turn around, there's a photo in a tabloid of Richard Gere with his arm around the Dalai Lama. Not that Tibetan Buddhism is necessarily a new religious movement, but we have been confronted again with a lot of those images that are outside the context of the traditional landscape. It's those McDonald's arches sticking up out of the forest again. And we're taken aback. Whoa, where did that come from? What does that mean? So, who joins these religions and why? Why are people so drawn to these alternative religions? And that question presupposes that lots and lots and lots of people are joining new religions, which in most cases is not really the way it is. A few weeks ago, I'm taping this in the spring of 2008. I had to think what year it is. The Pew Charitable Trust put out some recent statistics about Americans' tendency to change religions. And what was fascinating was that nearly 50% of adult Americans say that they have changed religions within their lifetime. What they believed as children is different from what they practice now. About 44% is what they said. So as people are changing their religious beliefs, and as traditional religious institutions have been eroded as far as people's confidence towards them, as people are seeking some different things, the new religions have appeared to be much more likely possibilities. And many people have checked them out along with what we might call the traditional options that people would have had available. So more and more people are at least reading one of the books, at least going to one of the conferences and seeing what these groups have to offer. There are many different theories as to why people join new religious movements. I will not confuse you with a lot of people's names, but I will share some of the theories that have been tossed around for the last 3 or 4 decades. The first theory, and it was widely accepted for a while, and I will say this, as I share theories with you, they are not mutually exclusive. If you take one, you've got to cast aside all the others. Indeed, you may perceive that there are elements of truth in each of them, and I'd have to agree with you on that. But the first theory that was thrown about a lot was called deprivation theory. And the idea was that people are doing without something in their lives as they are, and they find in a new religion something that they could not find in any traditional religion, and so they grasp for it there. Deprivation theory simply says people want something, and that's the only store that's got it, so they're going to go there. Well, it would be hard to refute that people choose new religions because they're finding something there that is missing from their lives otherwise. Another theory about why people join new religions is called role theory. And it's not really so much about the why as it is the how. According to role theory, everyone exists in particular relationships to every religion they encounter, new or otherwise. And with role theory, the idea is that most people would start out as an adversary to the new religion that they encounter. Perhaps some Wiccans or modern-day witches move in next door. At first, they're adversarial and say, "Oh, those people, I wish we could sell our house and move elsewhere. I don't want to live next to these people." But as time goes by, they start saying, well, they are good neighbors, and they've really made their yard look great. And most peaceful people, occasionally they do a ritual in the backyard, but, they play some drums, they play some flutes. It's really pretty. you know, I'm okay with having them as neighbors. So you've moved from the role of adversary to the role of good neighbor. So then they invite you over for a vegetarian potluck, and you say, well, it'd be rude to turn them down. And so you go over and then you eat the roast pumpkin or whatever, and you participate alongside, and then you're kind of a friend, a pal. And you like that enough that they said, well, next week we're doing another vegetarian potluck. You want to come again? You go, yeah. And then when you do it a couple of times, you've moved into the role of occasional participant. And at a given point, role theory says, it's not that big a leap to move from the occasional participant into the regular participant. And if you're a regular participant, why not just sign up? Well, that's role theory. Why do people join? Well, sometimes it just happens through a series of encounters. The most popular, perhaps over the last 30 or 40 years, has been the theory of brainwashing, that people are sucked into new religions by deceptive people who are trying to lure them into something. Generally, according to brainwashing theories, there is deception involved, there is coercion involved, and people essentially wind up in new religions against their will. I've got to tell you that this is largely based upon the idea that rational people would not join alternative religions. And that there's widely held this notion that long ago, people tended to hold pre-modern ideas about reality. And by pre-modern, we mean they believed in gods and goddesses and heaven and hell and so on. But then at a given point, the Enlightenment took place, and almost everybody moved from a pre-modern point of view to a modern point of view. Modern being characterized, modernity being characterized by a mechanistic view of the world as a mechanical being, a totally naturalistic. And now there were a few people who didn't get it, so there's kind of a subculture of pre-modernists. And then in recent years, a few postmoderns have come along, people who just really can't take all the impact of science. They can't take the world straight up, as it were. They need something else, and they've rejected the pre-modern ideas, so they've kind of made up their own supernatural answers. And to these people, anybody who grew up taking the right kind of science classes, the right kind of, logic classes and so on, would never join a new religion. It's too irrational. So therefore, when a rational kid joins an irrational group, they must have done something to his head or her head. They must have messed with him. There's something going on. But I really believe that that view of intellectual history is not very accurate. Yes, there were plenty of pre-modern people in previous times, but there are plenty of pre-modern people now. People who still feel that there are supernatural beings, whether it's God or Allah or even Brahman, who are ultimately responsible for things the way they are. And by this standard, by this vision, modernity is actually kind of an aberration. The idea that is held really by a minority of people who live now, let alone over all time, that there is nothing supernatural, that the material world is all there is and it behaves mechanistically, that is a very, very small percentage of, there is a very small percentage of people who hold that as the primary element of their worldview. So pre-modernism has continued on largely unabated. Postmodernism has come along for people who also believe in the supernatural and who believe in a spiritual realm, but who don't like those pre-modern answers. So in that sort of setting, what we see with people joining new religions is not irrational necessarily as much as alternatively rational. People operating rationally on the basis of presuppositions that science-minded people or even traditional pre-modern people like Christians and Jews don't quite understand. And once again, because we don't understand them, we want to somehow make it somebody else's fault, especially if someone we love has adopted those ideas. They must have had their heads messed with. No rational person would believe that. Well, no rational person that believes the presuppositions that we believe would believe that. But they have altered the presuppositions, so that then becomes rational for them. Brainwashing was actually what was responsible for most of the anti-cult activity that took place in the 70s and 80s, well, even up through the present. There are certainly plenty of websites that will tell you that the reason people join new religions is brainwashing, and they will give pretty elaborate scenarios of how that has taken place. But the whole concept of brainwashing is pretty suspect for a variety of reasons. The history of brainwashing, mesmerism or hypnotism was seen as kind of a quasi-science back in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And the idea that through hypnosis or mesmerism people could be suggested to do things that they would not normally do, like cluck like a chicken or do other odd things. That was believed that if people just knew how to do that, they could manipulate others. During the Korean War, there were soldiers from the United States who were captured by the North Koreans who wound up sending messages to their peers saying, surrender, these are good people, do not fight against them. We are in the wrong, we in the United States, just give up and go home. And because of our ideas about patriotism, that no red-blooded American individual soldier would do that, we determined that they must have had their minds messed with. They must have been manipulated into that. Well, we do have 30 or 40 years now of new religions, virtually all of which have been accused of brainwashing. There's even been quite an industry called deprogramming, in which people have been kidnapped out of their new religions and then gone through what you might call a reverse brainwashing to try to get them out. So here's what we found. What we found is that people come and go from new religions all the time. There seem to have been some efforts on the part of new religions to try to restructure people's settings and thinking and so on, so that it would be difficult for those people to leave, but we see people leaving new religions all the time. We also see that even when deprogramming or reverse brainwashing is attempted, it really is not all that often effective. Consequently, the determinations are right now that brainwashing is not a very satisfactory explanation for why people join new religious movements. What is more satisfying? Well, again, deprivation theory, role theory, those account for some elements, certainly. Sociologist Rodney Stark, who is now working with Baylor University, has suggested what he calls the economic theory of religion. This simply means that just in the same way that people kind of shop for groceries or shop for gasoline prices or shop for clothing, that we live in a quote-unquote market right now where people are doing the same thing religiously. Because some of the classic hostilities against new religions have been minimized, because the confidence in traditional religions have also been eroded, that people feel that they can shop for more options, and essentially that they're going to settle in where they feel like they're getting the best reward for what they need to put into it. Ooh, you know, that kind of takes away some of the onus of the whole brainwashing thing, and says that most people walk into these groups well aware of what they're getting into and choosing that as a rational choice. It is interesting to observe that most people who join new religions do so at particular types or particular times of their lives. There are various times in people's lives where they have ended one thing but have not quite arrived at doing something else yet. You might compare this actually to walking. When you are walking and you're in mid-step, there's a moment when all your weight's not quite on either foot. You've kind of launched off of the back foot. You haven't quite transferred all your weight to your other foot. And you are very unstable at that time in your direction. If I'm standing here with both my feet planted squarely, it would be very difficult for somebody to come push me over. I'm a large guy. But if I'm walking and somebody hits me from the side, it's very easy to throw me off course and to go a whole different direction because I'm not quite established. I'm kind of in between. We call that condition of being in between liminality. It's an it's a type of situation that pops up several times in individuals' lives. When you leave home and go off to college, you leave the security of your hometown and your family and the school where you've perhaps gone 4 years or 12 years, and suddenly you're going off to a new place. You're in mid-stride. You're kind of vulnerable to new ideas then. You're kind of looking into a lot of different options. A sudden divorce, sudden death in the family, bankruptcy, going through a change in careers. Retirement, we're beginning to see, is a time when more older people are looking into new religions, looking into different answers. Basically, any time in your life where you're in mid-step, where you've kind of got that uncertainty about where your weight is, so to speak, those are the times when people are most susceptible or most likely to be recruited into alternative religions. There are a number of insights that scholars have come up with about how conversion to new religions takes place. Some of the things they found is that recruitment tends to take place through personal relationships. The whole idea of the prophet on the corner, proclaiming his message and people flocking around really doesn't happen. The effectiveness of tracts left under windshield wipers, not so likely to make a change. But, just as we talked about, say, with the Wiccans living next door, positive interactions with somebody of this particular group is one of the predisposing factors towards people ultimately joining it. The second attribute of this sort of conversion is that it is affective ties. It's connections with people inside the group that really have an impact on your life that tend to bring you that direction. Now, it is true that intense integration keeps people in new groups. And one of the things that actually makes people nervous about a lot of the new religions is that as soon as somebody becomes a member, they've got stuff to do. They've got responsibilities, whether it's recruiting new members or whether it's doing particular things with the worship center or whatever. From the very beginning, you are given a role. The involvement, the likelihood of involvement in a new religion often also relates to negative or weak ties with non-new religion people. For instance, if you have those new religious people move in next door to you and they're really nice, at the same time you're having a messy fight with your family and perhaps going through a divorce, so you feel that through all that your family's mad at you, your church is mad at you, and so on, that also leads to the tendency to be involved. However, I just said something about people leaving from one church and going to another. The people who are most likely to join a new religion are those who would identify themselves prior to their engagement with the new religion as unaligned, people who are unaffiliated. We do have quite the phenomenon in the United States in particular of people who identify themselves as spiritual but not necessarily members of any particular group. These are people who often do join new religions because, again, they don't have the prejudices against them that people of existing religions often do. It is not uncommon. As a matter of fact, it's far more likely that the person who joins up with a new religion is somebody who has been seeking for some time and perhaps trying out different alternatives. It is also true, and this almost goes without saying, that every new religion provides particular benefits for those who join it. They join up and get something out of it they were not getting somewhere else. And so they're often very, very happy to share with others and to invite them to join, which reinforces outsiders' idea, oh look, they've been brainwashed, they're trying to get me in too. So you might ask, okay, we've talked about liminality and so on. Who is most likely to get involved in new religions? Is it the social misfits? Is it those who are seriously alienated? Is it the losers of this world? Well, not necessarily. If you look at people who join new religious movements, and this now is looking back over 30 or 40 years, especially in the United States, and this would primarily apply more to the new religions instead of the older new religions, The average person who would join such a group is somebody who is at a liminal stage in life, but somebody who has a higher than average education, partially because that education results in a world in which they see more options. They tend to be people who have a slightly higher than average income. These are not people who are scrounging just to get by. These are people who have the leisure, you might say, to make choices about what they're going to believe. There is not necessarily a gender difference. Neither men nor women are more likely to get in these groups, although there are certain groups that appeal to each gender. Far, far, far more male Satanists, for instance, and far, far, far more women Wiccans. There are other groups that also tend to specialize by gender. As said before, it's those folks who have previously not been particularly committed to another group who are most likely to get involved. So, are these people dangerous? We've got to come down to that. Are they dangerous groups? And depending on how old you are or how much you've read, you may have seen the flames coming up out of the compound at Waco, or you may have memories of those photos of people lying around having died of poison, both at Jonestown or with Heaven's Gate. Well, certainly every group needs to be evaluated, every religious group you ever encounter, for what their agenda is. What is their worldview? What are their highest goals? What is it that they are promoting for their membership? Are they obsessive about the control of these people? Do they use a lot of adversarial language? Are they groups which imagine some sort of gigantic conspiracy against them, for which they must be prepared and ultimately be ready to sacrifice their own lives? If you hear a lot of rhetoric about violence, then yeah, that may well be a group that would be best to avoid, or at least study very carefully to see how that language is used as related to the practices of the group. But are the members of new religions inherently more likely to commit violence against others or themselves than people of any other religious group? Not necessarily.